So we're in the final week of this exploration of God's big story, and it's a story that's been unfolding throughout all of history, especially since Adam and Eve and God's unrelenting pursuit of relationship with us, and at the same time, Satan's never-ending schemes to separate us from God and to break that relationship. And it's a story about invitation and relationship, and it includes us too if we're willing to enter. So as we close out this series, let's take a look at the story we heard about on Sunday from Luke. It's in chapter 5 of Luke. So go ahead and flip to that right now. It's a story about Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends, and this is the story of how he is invited into the story. At the point where Luke is describing in chapter 5, verse 1, Jesus has already begun his ministry. He's starting to pick up some steam. He's teaching, he's healing, he's starting to really draw attention. He's drawing a crowd, and everybody wants to be around him. Now, Jesus at this point starts to surround himself with his small group. And there are a few more open seats in his circle, so he's going out to find somebody to join his small group, and he comes upon Peter in this chapter. Verse 1, here's a story. One day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret with the people crowding around him and listening to the word of God, he saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, this is the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and he taught the people from the boat. So at this point in the story, Peter definitely isn't looking to enter any kind of story that Jesus is writing. In fact, he's already got a story he's writing on his own. He's a fisherman. That's his trade. He's a hard worker, and he's just cleaning up his nets, getting ready to go home. And this is the point in which Jesus interrupts Simon Peter's story and invites him to be a part of something bigger. So Jesus hops into his boat, and he starts preaching to the crowds. And he could have at that point just said, "Thanks for your boat. Have a great morning. See you around." But instead, what does he say to Peter in verse 4? "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Okay, so Peter replies, "Master, we've worked all night long and haven't caught anything." I think that Peter's a little annoyed at this point, and maybe that's just the way I read it, but he's already worked all night. He's really exhausted. He's probably frustrated because they haven't caught anything. He's just endured a lot of long preaching. There are crowds, so he's caught up in some boat traffic, and I would be grumpy. So I just assume that Peter's grumpy too. And if anybody knows me, before I eat breakfast, I'm definitely grumpy. But I think everybody, if their small stories get interrupted, we feel a sense of annoyance because we know how it's supposed to go. We're writing it on our own. But here Peter says, "Okay, if you say so, I will let down the nets." So that's awesome. He calls Jesus master, and he goes ahead and does what Jesus says to do. He accepts that invitation. So when he does that, what happens next? They caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. And in verse 7, they signaled their partner boats to come over and help them. And when those boats came, they filled them both and they began to sink. There's just this amazing extravagance, the same kind of extravagance that we saw at the wedding at Cana. Jesus didn't just supply a little bit of wine to get them through the night. It was the equivalent of 680 bottles of wine. And here at Gennesaret, he doesn't just give them a few fish, he gives them a boat sinking amount of fish. It's an extravagant, big story. And he takes Jesus up on that invitation and experiences that extravagant love. And what is at that point Peter's response? In verse 8, he says, he falls down at Jesus' knees and says, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." And this is the same response that we heard from Isaiah. It's the same response we heard from Jeremiah. Each one of us, and Peter too, me too, probably you too, are saying, no, we're not qualified. We're not ready. We're not good enough. This big story is not for me. It's for somebody else. And I know that when I look at the bad choices I've made in pursuit of that validation and acceptance that I look for, I know when I look at the resentments that I carry against people I think have let me down, or the disappointment I harbor, I look at all that and I say, just depart from me. I'm a sinful woman. You don't want me in your big story. Just let me go back to my small story. I would just spoil it. That's what I think. But Jesus has a different reply that encourages Peter. He says in verse 10, "Don't be afraid, for now you will catch men." God will rewrite our small stories if we accept his invitation. He knows the sin that we bring. He knows the small stories that we weave and write on our own. And he wants us to engage in his bigger story. He invites us to do that, and he says, don't be afraid. You don't know how it's going to go, but don't be afraid. And what I know of story is that it is irresistible. When someone tells a story, people lean in and they want to hear what happens next. That's the kind of story that God is writing in your life if you say yes. He writes a story for you to share with other people, and he wants to use even the sin that's become redeemed to reach out to other people whose stories are also not yet written. He's giving Peter here a testimony to reach other unfinished people, because he knows that Peter is unfinished. He knows that you and I are unfinished, and he's going to use our stories to catch other people up into his big, epic story of redemption and restoration.